It's John Pollock along with Cody Saftik, and we have the official news now regarding George St-Pierre's return. Dana White appearing on ESPN earlier in the day on Wednesday to announce that George St-Pierre will in fact move up to 185 pounds and, Cody, challenge Michael Bisping for the championship.
Yeah, interesting call for sure. I mean, I think we all knew that George St-Pierre was going to come back at some point. I think a lot of talks were headed towards that Michael Bisping matchup. And I know you're talking about make the biggest fight for him possible, and this is a big fight, but I don't know that this is the biggest fight possible. I don't know that this is a good idea for the 185-pound division, keeping it tied down like this. There's no right or wrong answer, but I can see a lot of people coming out and critiquing this.
I definitely think that there's going to be criticism that is met with this fight because of the implications it could have on the middleweight division. I don't think anyone necessarily anticipates George St-Pierre sticking around if he were to win this title, and you could theoretically create another division that's left in chaos, albeit one night where they're going to do tremendous business. But I think, Cody, if we look at UFC 208 earlier this month, the numbers that'll come in for 209, albeit a very good card on paper this weekend, we're looking at all these cards, Dallas, even the featherweight title fight in Brazil. These are not fights that are going to be gigantic successes on pay-per-view, and this is the first fight this year that the UFC has announced that will be a big fight, and I think that certainly took precedence over the state of the middleweight division. And I think more than anything, George St-Pierre coming and fighting for the championship in his first fight at middleweight, it's asking a lot of a guy that hasn't fought since 2013.
Listen, I don't disagree that it's a big fight, and hopefully it does big business for them. But once again, the narrative is that this is going to be a million buy pay-per-view event.
I don't know if it's that big.
Michael Bisping historically doesn't sell well on pay-per-view. You look at his last fight against Dan Henderson, and not a pay-per-view that sold traditionally well at all. You look at the last time George competed, UFC 167, and it was about between 600,000 and 650,000 buys. So when we last saw George in 2003, maybe that drawing power is leaving him ever so slightly. And Michael Bisping's a guy that a fan favorite, someone who's been fighting for a long time, but not necessarily some big draw by no stretch of the imagination. If you look at what's the biggest fight we could have made with George St-Pierre, you have to assume it's the Conor McGregor fight. Now, anybody against McGregor is probably the biggest fight they can make, but even rematches with the Diaz brothers or that fight with Anderson Silva seem to make a little more sense, saying that if he wins against Michael Bisping, as you talked about, we don't know if he's sticking around at middleweight. We don't know if he's ever going to defend. If he loses to Michael Bisping, does Michael Bisping stick around? He's now had 2 title defenses against a 47-year-old challenger not ranked in the top 10 and a welterweight who has never fought at middleweight, also not ranked in the top 10. At what point is it just a farce that you're just looking to make big fights?
It might be appropriate if this fight ends up taking place on that 4th of July
I think it will, yeah.
International Fight Week, because this is a gigantic fireworks display on the 4th of July where it looks spectacular. That night, it's incredible. The next morning, there's a mess left over in its wake where it's just all debris and how do we put everything back together? If George St-Pierre is your middleweight champion, not to mention that this is going to ice that division, your Yoel Romero's come to mind, who cannot at all view this as a positive message, because you're either going to take a dangerous fight in between or you're sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens here, which this fight, we don't know a date, we don't know a venue, and it's going to be wait and see for Yoel Romero, who's getting up there in age.
Yeah, not only Yoel Romero, but if you're Jacare, you're in the exact same position here. You're someone who's getting a little older in age. You're likely the number 1 or number 2 contender in the world. And if you sit around, you're getting older, and sitting around has proven to never be a good idea in the UFC. If you take a fight, they're going to say, well, why don't you fight Yoel Romero as the co-feature or on the main card of that same pay-per-view of George St-Pierre versus Michael Bisping. It's a fun fight, but you have to take a massive fight once again to perhaps get a title fight. And the issue there is if you're Yoel Romero, or a Jacare, and you get that win, it's, well, George won, if he won, and he's thinking what he's going to do, and he's renegotiating a big fight, and maybe he's going to go down. So much uncertainty that sitting on the sideline is probably inevitable for one of those guys, and that's just a big letdown on its own. I mean, they deserve the opportunity to go out there and compete, and they just really haven't been afforded that to this point. You look at 185, and yeah, you're right, there could be a big mess here. There could be a lot of questions that are unanswered, but you look at all their other divisions. You look at 155 pounds, you look at 145 pounds, there's question marks across the board, John. They're almost going into that boxing and into that pro wrestling route of just makes the biggest fights possible, but as a result, their divisions are starting to take a bit of a hit.
Yeah, I mean, this is also, though, a fight that coming after The last we saw of George St-Pierre, it was a generation ago in mixed martial arts years when he fought Johnny Hendricks. There's going to be a lot of questions. Michael Bisping, traditionally a guy with outstanding conditioning, very good takedown defense as well. This is a winnable fight for Michael Bisping, whereas I think a few years ago, people wouldn't really have that interest in this fight. I think that there's certainly an argument to be made here for Michael Bisping because there are going to be endless questions about George St-Pierre and where he is in comparison to the last time he saw the inside of an octagon.
Yeah, I agree. You hear Robin Black talk about it all the time, you know, how the game develops and sometimes it just passes you by. George was so good at what he did that maybe he's not one of those guys that falls in that category. But there's no denying that everyone else's takedown defense has gotten better. Everyone's a little bit bigger. George, not particularly a big welterweight, certainly wouldn't be a big middleweight by no stretch. But Michael Bisping's had good spots in his career, fighting guys like Chael Sonnen, where he can stuff his takedowns, keep the fight standing, then he could do the same thing. But even beyond that, this is a winnable fight for both guys, and that's why there's some intrigue. But let's say George wins and George gets Yoel Romero. What's the game plan against Yoel Romero? You're not taking down Yoel. Could a guy half of the size of Yoel Romero stand with him for a long period of time? As George St-Pierre fans, we don't want to see the guy get hurt. So fun fights are acceptable, but fights for the title, unless he really deserved it, unless he really merited it, the only reason he's in this spot is because he is George St-Pierre. But has he done anything at 185 pounds or even in the last 3 years to get this shot? I don't know.
Who is the first middleweight that is going to be on ice as a result of this announcement that is going to challenge the winner of that light heavyweight title fight?
I mean, you'd want to say Yoel Romero just because it seems like he's got a bad reputation. Whether that's warranted or not, people are so against him because of the USADA stuff and the grabbing of the fences and the stool gate that I feel like he's the guy that's really going to suffer the most from this. If you're Jacare Souza, you match up good with both Michael Bisping and George St-Pierre. There's a lot of intrigue. I see him possibly getting that shot, but it's just disarray right now. If you want to see the best fights possible, these are not the best fights possible. They're the biggest fights possible. And if you like MMA and you like the UFC, they have to do well, John. They have to put up big numbers, and these are the fights they have to make. But that doesn't mean you have to like it.
Yeah, I think that this ultimately comes down to this is a revenue-generating fight, which some people are going to scoff at, but the fact is the reason it's a revenue-generating fight is because the most amount of people are interested in it, and there are people that are going to disagree with this fight and the matchmaking and the possible implications. There is negative to this, but there's a whole lot of positive, and this is a year where the first 6 months on pay-per-view are not going to look pretty for the UFC, and they're banking on the last half of 2017 with fights like this that are truly going to be that shot in the arm for their pay-per-view business, which is likely to not hit record levels like it did in 2016.
Yeah, I agree. When you're looking at the big stars, and we need Conor, we need Ronda Rousey, and beyond that, we don't have much. If Ronda's not an option, Conor's taken some time off, some of their other stars have faded a little bit, it's pivotal to bring back a guy like George St-Pierre, and George St-Pierre has to be in a winnable fight that's going to create some intrigue. Michael Bisping is a winnable fight for him. It's an intriguing fight, it's a fun fight, and obviously with the title being added to it, it just adds that little extra bit. But I just honestly really think to myself, I'm someone who's watched MMA for a long time, and being a dual champion used to be something big, you know, a Randy Couture or a BJ Penn. Now it just seems like everybody in their own way. I mean, Conor McGregor most definitely earned it, but if a George wins the middleweight title, now he's a 2-division champion. I don't doubt that an Amanda Nunes can move up to 145, and now she's a 2-division champion. Joanna and Jacek will likely, if they open up 125, go there. You've just got so much going on that in a world where it's hard to just keep up from event to event, from week to week, you're going to get casual fans that just fall out of love with it.
It's going to be a very interesting couple of days. They're going to be holding a press conference in Las Vegas Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, where we can expect more details to come out about this middleweight title fight and the return of George St-Pierre. That press conference will be carried live here on Fight Network, so tune in, and we'll be back later this week chatting about the return of George St-Pierre.